What is a paradox? Well, some might say that's what happens when the radiologist and the internist get together. You have a pair of docs. Well, paradox, P-A-R-A-D-O-X, is an important word for us to have some understanding of because we can get muddy in our thinking and find ourselves calling things paradox that are not for unhealthy reasons. Well, what is a paradox? A paradox is an apparent contradiction that, upon further study, is revealed to not be a contradiction. Well, in a future Ask RC, we're going to address the question, what is a contradiction? And we'll do another one on what is a mystery. So I don't want to unpack this too much, but one of the reasons we're doing all three is because, again, we confuse these things. There's overlap among these things, but there's also critical differences among these three terms. And when we don't recognize those differences, we end up in a bad place. Paradox is sometimes used as a synonym for contradiction, or a synonym for antinomy, which is also a synonym for contradiction. Antinomy, A-N-T-I-N-O-M-I-E, means words against each other, like a contra, against, diction, word. Same principle. Well, a paradox is not that. A paradox is not the same thing as an antinomy. A paradox is something that looks like a contradiction that's not. Now, a lot of times we're tempted to say something is a paradox because it is a contradiction, but we want to deny it. I remember many years ago, more years than some people could count, I was a student in seminary, and it was my very first semester in seminary, and I was blessed to take a class on the doctrine of election that was taught by Dr. Roger Nicole. Now, if you are not a part of the academic world of Reformed theology, that may mean nothing to you. If you are, you know Roger Nicole was one of the most respected Reformed theologians of the 20th century. He taught for most of his career at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Boston, but I had him at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. Sweetheart of a guy. Smart as a whip. But in this class on election, he said something to this effect. He said that God's sovereignty and man's free will were like two parallel lines that intersect in infinity. And I confess that some of my classmates were bowled over by this deep, heavy-sounding insight. Doesn't that just sound so spiritual and incomprehensible? Well, incomprehensible, yes. Spiritual, not so much. I raised my hand. I said, Dr. Nicole, if I understand what you just said correctly, I think what you said is that the sovereignty of God and the free will of man are like two lines that never intersect, that do intersect. You see, the word parallel line, that expression, describes two lines that never intersect. And to say that they intersect at infinity is to deny what they are. If they intersect, they're not parallel. If they're parallel, they don't intersect. This is describing the sovereignty of God and the free will of man as a paradox, or trying to describe it as a paradox, but what you're really doing is describing it as a contradiction. Now, today we're not here to answer the difficulty of understanding the sovereignty of God and man's free will. We're simply trying to define our terms here with respect to paradox. So, real paradox? Here's a real paradox. He who gains his life will lose it, and he who loses his life will gain it. If you want to be first, you need to be last. And the last will be first. This looks like a contradiction, but really what Jesus is saying, if you want to be first in this sense, you got to be last in that sense. If you want to gain your life in this sense, you got to lose your life in that sense. A second glance reveals that we're talking about a different relationship, which means we're not affirming A and not A at the same time and in the same relationship, which is a hint about what we'll do when we get to what is a contradiction.